This is a perennial digression, an extended experiment in pretending that my graduate studies were useful. My name is David Armstrong, but more importantly, I'm joined by Dr. Anantanand Rambachan, professor of religion at St. Olaf College. Dr. Rambachan is a prolific scholar of Advaita Vedanta and one of the foremost Hindu theologians writing in English today, boasting such works as the Advaita Worldview, God, World, and Humanity, a Hindu theology of liberation, not two is not one, and essays in Hindu theology. The last of these includes some of his extensive work in interfaith cooperation, dialogue, and comparative theology. Dr. Rambachan, thanks for agreeing to do this. I'm delighted to be speaking with you, and it's a really generous use of your time.
It's wonderful to meet you, David, and I'm happy for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know you recently, I think just like the other day, did one of these with my friend Saad on his podcast. So we'll touch on some of the same stuff, but I want to try to make it worth your while with some unique questions. I'm first interested, though, in how you got into the fields you now work in, both as a scholar of texts and also as a Hindu theologian, because I'm always interested in this. You know, I mean, most people who practice religions are not actually like scholars of their traditions, right? So I'm interested in what drives people to become a scholar of their tradition.
Thank you, David. So, I from a young age, I had a deep interest in religion. Both of my grandfathers were Hindu priests. So I had a rich exposure to Hindu traditions from a very early age. And after I finished my undergraduate studies, I chose to go to India and to join a monastic institution with traditional teachers. And so I lived with my teacher for 3 years. I was not pursuing a degree in in the academic sense. We were studying sacred texts, particularly the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutras and other texts, with the commentaries, especially the commentary of Shankara. This teacher was in the tradition of the Hindu non-dual or Advaita tradition. So I lived with him for 3 years, as I said, engaged in this deep traditional study. And at the end of it, I had the decision to make. A lot of my fellow students went on to become monks. I was quite young still, David. I was still in my early 20s. And I felt that I did not know enough about the world of knowledge outside of the Hindu tradition, because my undergraduate degree was not in religion or religious studies. And I wanted to learn more about the study of religion at the university, what was happening, what kind of texts people were reading, what were the discussions taking place, and how to explore how what I learned in this very deep and profound way with my teacher fit or did not fit in this larger academic study of religion. So this took me back to graduate school in the United Kingdom at the University of Leeds, Department of Theology and Religious Studies, where I did my master's and then eventually my PhD degrees. And of course, subsequently, as you mentioned, to a career of of teaching in the United States. But I think I found a way to bring my traditional study and the academic study together, which is still very important and very central to my approach, because for my dissertation, which was a 4-year project, I was looking at the traditional studies that I did and the traditional understanding of the nature and the function and role of what we call the Sruti in Sanskrit, or the authoritative text, and the relation, and the understanding of the function of the authoritative text in the classical Vedanta tradition, and the contemporary, some prominent contemporary interpretations, which I felt were minimizing the classical significance of scripture. So I felt that I brought these two together in my research work, and it's an approach or a method that has defined, I think, my work subsequently. I am grateful that I had these 3 years of very traditional study. They have defined me and blessed me and enriched me in ways that I could not have had otherwise. But I'm also grateful that I had the opportunity to pursue the academic inquiry, which allows me, David, to ask different questions of the text as well. There are questions that traditional readers of the text ask, which academics don't ask, and there are questions that academics ask of a text which the traditional readers of the text don't ask. So I hope that I try to continue asking both kinds of questions and new questions.
Yeah, I really relate to a lot of that. I wish I could say that I've been to India, but I haven't. I was from a very early age just really nerdy about religion. I've self-identified as a Christian my whole life, but I've always been very eclectically and ecumenically interested. And when people have asked me, why I went to 3 years of undergrad in religious studies, a master's degree in religious studies, and then another master's degree in classics, my answer is usually something to the effect of, I had questions, but what I realized was that I didn't even know what questions I should be asking about the resources of my religion and other religions I was interested in. And so the secular education gave me the tools, kind of similar to what you're saying, gave me the tools to ask good questions and for how to construct good answers. That's not exclusive to being a practitioner and having emic questions and answers, but that puts those in I like to think of it, it gives them teeth, it proceeds from a wider range of vision. And that tends to be the sort of work I'm interested in with texts across the board in whatever tradition I'm working in, is how can I do critical study of this text in a way that would be respectable in school, while at the same time asking and answering questions about it that will be significant for the people who are traditionally interested in these kinds of texts, right?
Exactly. So I understand that, and it resonates with me, because I think the extreme that one can go to in the academic world is to ask all of the questions about the text, but not the questions in which a practitioner of the text, or the text within the tradition, not to ask about its meaning for those communities. And then, of course, on the other extreme, the communities in which the texts are read and used either liturgically or scholastically, they don't ask questions about the, say, the history of the text, the context of the text, the formation of the text, or its relevance, for our reality in today's world. So I think, it's not always easy, as you would surely understand, to be asking both kinds of questions. But I think it's a proper way to go, especially if you, as I am, I am I approach my tradition as a scholar. I'm learning from other scholars who identify with the tradition, but I'm also learning from other scholars who do not regard themselves as practitioners of the tradition. I regard myself as a scholar of my tradition, but also as a practitioner. So as a practitioner, I know that these texts offered meaning to people who read them. They, in the traditional context, the texts were read as moksha shastra. Shastra means a sacred text, but as moksha shastra means they were read as texts that opened up the vision of the reader to what it means to be a liberated being. So people came to these texts when they experienced, a deep anxiety about existence and were searching for, the more, searching for meaning in life. They turned to these texts. So I also turn to these texts in this way, but I'm also looking at, the historical context as far as we can understand, the social context, and that is what that also helps me to bring to my work, in recent years, especially the concern of liberation theology, the concern with social justice and human dignity and human rights. Those kinds of issues were not really, the concern of traditional readers, and another concern of traditional readers even today.
Well, let's get into some of that stuff. So I should preface this by saying I'm attempting to teach myself Sanskrit, and I'm definitely going to mispronounce something today. So forgive me ahead of time. I'm better at the European side of Indo-European languages than I am at the Indian side, to my great shame. So let's start with the Advaita Worldview and work our way forward. So you write in that book about the way that the ideal student of Advaita comes to have interest in discovering the non-dual wisdom of the Vedas. You pursue and cultivate the three primary goals: artha, or wealth; kama, or pleasure; dharma, or righteousness, or just however, understanding that there are kind of different ways to render these in English. But the prospective student finds that dukkha, dissatisfaction, suffering, persists anyway, and this opens the way to realizing that the final goal is moksha, or liberation. I'm wondering, you mentioned the social aspect of this, and I'm wondering whether and in what ways the enumeration of these goals in this order and the traditional means for attaining them have maybe changed in modern Hinduism. Because I'm thinking about, especially having recently read A Hindu Theology of Liberation, many individuals in modern India and in Hindu diaspora communities have limited access to reasonable attainment of the first three goals, right? For a variety of social and cultural reasons. So how do modern Hindus understand the Hindu life cycle, and when should someone start seeking liberation? When would we say today is the ideal time to start pursuing moksha?
Well, that's a really interestingly framed question. So, and feel free, if I'm not getting at the specific question that you are
Oh, no worries. This is, this show is called A Perennial Digression. So say whatever you like, honestly.
So I think that these four goals that you mentioned, wealth, which is, includes success in the world, power, independence, karma or pleasure, it circumscribes all kinds of pleasure, sense, enjoyment, but also the pleasures of the fine arts, of music, and so on. And then you have dharma, which is the realm of ethics, ethical conduct, and moksha or liberation. These four goals, I would say, describe what the Hindu tradition regards as a full human life. They are worthy goals that human beings should pursue. So, as you can see from this, that the Hindu tradition is not, at least as described in these four goals, it is not an anti-materialistic tradition. It is not a pleasure-rejecting tradition. But and there is some hope, I guess, when I think of these goals, that at some point in time, even after one has met one's material needs, not in abundant wealth, but at least satisfactorily, and one has, enjoyed the pleasures of life, and one lives a responsible, moral and ethical life. One is attentive to virtues like non-injury, ahimsa, truth, satya. One is generous, one practices self-control, and so on. Perhaps there's a hope that, living in some sequence, one would come to a wish for liberation or for moksha. But I think, looking at the conversations and dialogues that are recorded in the Upanishads, this desire for moksha can occur at any time in one's life. It is the fruit of a reflective life, a thoughtfully or mindfully led life. So in one of the Upanishads, which is the Mundaka Upanishad, we have a very famous text, which in translation makes the point that a thoughtful human being, after examining, his or her own pursuits, and discovering that everything that she or he has gained leaves her with a sense of a perpetuating sense of want or incompleteness. Dissatisfaction, or the word you think you used before, is dukkha, or sorrow, existential suffering. He or she should seek out a teacher, because this person is now knocking on the doors of the quest for moksha, and the religious life, in a sense, begins with a new intensity at that moment. It could happen, and there are examples in the Upanishads of such a search being conducted by young people, by elderly people, but it's a search that the tradition seems to think will at some point in time be ignited in us all, because some of us may come to it quickly, some may take a while to realize that, as the texts themselves put it, that the finite is not going to satisfy us. The finite is limited. It is, as the word itself indicates, it's transient. It leaves us incomplete. And at some point in time, we will all begin with intensity to ask this question, is there anything more? And that question is what the tradition, seems to be waiting for. The answer is not meaningful, I would say. The answer that the tradition gives is not meaningful unless the question is asked intensely. So the student or the disciple in these conversations is described as someone who is intensely asking these questions, not frivolously, not cynically, but like one traditional example is like a person whose head is in fire would rush to a lake. These questions have become burning questions, for the human being, and that's the beginning of the religious quest in its truest sense. And I think it's not, if I may say so, Dave, and I give the example that this such a quest or such an awakening, a sense of, it is not failure in life, right? It is not fear of the world. I give the example of Tolstoy, who was a very successful man by all standards of his time, but suddenly felt, a complete sense of meaninglessness in his existence, and started to ask, these fundamental questions.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Koheleth in the Tanakh, or Ecclesiastes in the Christian canon, who is definitely not King Solomon as the author of that text, but like he's traditionally thought to be Solomon. And so the book is often read as, here's the wisest king on earth, right? Here's the most successful and powerful guy in the world. And he starts his book with everything is meaningless.
Yeah.
Everything is vanity, right?
Yes, everything is.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I have a question about that. I'm wondering if there's an answer in the Advaita tradition to this question. So, in Abrahamic or Adonistic traditions, whatever nomenclature you want to use in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there's usually an account for, why evil is part of the world, or why ignorance is part of the world, or why delusion is part of the world, right? And why we have to kind of overcome it. I understand the metaphysics, I think, in Advaita. If Atman is Brahman, and Brahman is both God and world, or God manifesting God's self as the infinity of finite forms that constitute the world, then the content of avidya, or ignorance, is our unawareness of what we really are, right? But my question is, I guess, does Advaita pose or answer the question, or how might you answer the question? How do we get Advaita, or how do we get avidya in the first place? Right? How do finite beings come to be ignorant to begin with of their essential unity, that the Atman is already Brahman, right? That the self is already full, as it possibly can be. How do we lose sight of that?
No, it's one of the topics of discussion and a topic of differences within the Advaita tradition. And I think the difference, the arguments cut through those who hold a position and describe avidya as something that is tangible, something that is real, and those who describe avidya as an absence of knowledge. Avidya doesn't have, it is not a positive reality. It has no ontological existence. It is simply it is an absence of right knowledge, but not a reality in its own nature. That's an ongoing topic of discussion. So Shankara himself, the most famous commentator on the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, and the systematizer of this Advaita tradition on the basis of his reading of the Upanishads. Interestingly, David, he does not linger too much on this, on trying to explain avidya in terms of its origin. He takes it as a fact of life, that we don't know who we are, and assumes that ignorance, so defined as the absence of knowledge, is always existing. Now, just to give you an example, I'm not sure how helpful it is. I never saw you before until I saw you a few minutes ago. So I can say that I was ignorant. I had a vidya of what David Armstrong looked like. And but at 4 p.m. Today, my avidya was dispelled when David appeared on.
I'm so sorry.
On my computer screen. So then one may ask, well, when did your ignorance of David start? When were you first ignorant of David? And it is plausible to say, that I was always ignorant of David. Ignorant was my ignorance of David had no beginning, or if it had a beginning, surely it started when I was born, but it ended the moment when he came onto my screen. So generally speaking, there isn't much focus on accounting in Advaita for the origin of avidya, nor do I think one would find satisfactory answers, because David, when you think about it, it is deeply connected, if not identical, with the question about why the world, why a universe with this particular nature, with these particular features, why human beings are constituted as they are, why is the cosmos constituted, where did it come from, and why is it here? It is a fact that it is here. Advaita on the whole assumes a similar approach to avidya. Avidya exists, we don't know who we are, and that the energies of the tradition are directed more on the how do we overcome avidya, what is the solution to avidya. In a sense, even though we are subject to avidya, we don't know what is the nature of this avidya until we begin to read the sacred texts. We don't know that we are ignorant of who we are, because we have assumptions about our nature. About the center of Advaita is to tell us the nature of I, the self. But we don't even know that we are ignorant of this self. We come to a teacher, we come to the inquiry because of the experience of dukkha or suffering or sorrow, in spite of all of our gains or achievements, but that the cause of this suffering, the cause of this suffering is this condition of avidya. We don't know. This is something that we come to learn from the tradition, from the sacred text, from the teacher. So even though avidya exists, our understanding of what exactly is the nature of avidya, what it is centered on, what is it that we are ignorant of, it itself is part of the teaching and learning process in the Advaita tradition.
Yeah, that's a very similar answer to the Augustinian answer to the problem of evil, that evil is privatio boni. It's not an actual thing, it's just the absence of good, right?
Yes.
And in that sense, it's almost like a misfiring of existence, evil, such that where evil occurs, something else should have been there and is just sort of stumbling its way towards being that. So in a similar way, right, you could say like avidya is the absence of liberating knowledge.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It is the absence of liberating knowledge. It's the condition we're born into, and then eventually we grow out. We grow out of it because we obtain the knowledge. Sort of like my daughter. My daughter is very upset because she doesn't understand when she's hungry or when she's tired, or she doesn't get it, so she cries, right? And similarly, like, we don't understand things, so we suffer tremendously, right?
Yes.
So that leads very nicely into the next question I had on this. So you present in the Advaita Worldview, the lucidity with which you present the Advaitin understanding of liberation is so great that it might actually be easy to make the mistake of thinking that simply intellectually grasping the material is enough to achieve liberation. My suspicion is that it's not that easy. If you tell me that by correctly understanding moksha, I am a jivan mukti, I'm not going to be upset with you, but I suspect that that's not sufficient. So to what extent is liberating knowledge a set of ideas that we try to cultivate? And to what extent is it like a living perception or intellection or set of activities that we engage in response to the nature of reality? What's the how do we defend against thinking that just understanding the mechanics of this makes us liberated, or does it?
No, thank you. That's a very good question. And certainly it is not repeating a word formula. That, and here the word formula might be I am Brahman. That is not what liberation is. It's not like a mantra that one repeats. So this, what is described as knowledge or jnana in this tradition is a discipline. Let me put it in that way. So we just spoke about avidya, and as you said, it leads nicely into this topic, into this theme. I have come. Let us, imagine the journey of a human being. I have come to discover that, in spite of all my gains in life, satisfying of all of my desires, I am in sorrow. I am in suffering. Therefore, I come to a teacher seeking freedom from condition of suffering, this condition of want, this condition of anxiety or fear. All of these are appropriate ways of describing, a real human experience, even the fear of mortality, the anxiety about dying. And I come to a teacher, and the teacher says, at the heart of your problem, your predicament, the fundamental cause of this condition of sorrow that you experience is a misunderstanding of who you are, or what is the truth of your nature, the truth of yourself, and that you are Brahman, the full being, the timeless being, the being without beginning, the being that is never diminished, the complete being. The word that is used for that fullness or completeness is Ananda. So now begins a process of teaching. So that being that the teacher says that I am, that reality that I am, is not something that I have to become. Because I am that. Even when I am ignorant of the truth of myself, I am that. Ignorance does not change the fundamental fact of my nature. It is even in the condition of ignorance. So it is a truth about myself, about my nature, that is immediately available. It is immediately available. So the problem here is a problem of ignorance. So there are certain traditional teaching methodologies, teaching methods in Advaita for enabling the student to grasp deeply and what he or she really is. And these methods are, we see these methods being used in the text and in the commentaries. Now, for these methods to work, for knowledge to replace ignorance, the tradition also stipulates that a student, a committed student, has to cultivate certain dispositions of mind, certain dispositions of heart and mind. One has to be calm in mind. One has to have control of one's senses. One has to be balanced in pleasure and in pain, in sukha, in dukkha. One has to have a certain detachment from greed for the finite, because you've come to understand the limits of the finite. So a certain disposition of mind has to be achieved, because the mind is the instrument, the mind is the place where this knowledge is going to take place, the knowledge is going to occur. It's like, think of it in this way, another analogy, David. If I want to see a good reflection of myself in a lake, then the water has to be still, the water has to be clear. Then when I look into the lake, I see myself as I am. So this is a process of seeing who I am, and this occurs in the mind, and the mind has to be transformed by the cultivation of these dispositions that are described well and described in great detail in the tradition. So even as I think and take myself now to be someone who was born a certain number of years ago, someone who would live for a certain number of years and then die, I should develop the same conviction that I am the unborn, the undying, the eternal Atma, and that, because that which we are seeking to know, as I said, is immediately available. It is here and now. It is what you are. I just confused. It is just taken to be what it is not. Therefore, through a process of teaching, you come to discern. You come to separate what you are from what you are not, and to through right knowledge to correct that problem of false understanding. But it's not simply words, because this is knowledge that makes a difference. It is transformative knowledge. When I know who I am, as we say, in fact, as one Upanishad puts it, Brahma vid Brahma eva bhavati. When one knows Brahman, one is Brahman. The know of Brahman is Brahman, or becomes Brahman.
So one question I have related to this. So you write in the Advaita Worldview about how Brahman Nirguna and Brahman Saguna, there's a mistake often in interpreters of the tradition in thinking that these two simply collapse into each other, right? That in fact, it's one and the same Brahman who can be considered from the angle of not having qualities or from the angle of having qualities. In a Christian context, we might say you can contemplate God through his energies as having attributes and qualities. You can't contemplate God according to his essence, according to what he is, because it's fundamentally unknowable.
Yes.
And where the finite manifestation of Brahman as individual beings in Brahman's Lila, his superabundance at play, is as all of us, right? And so a question that I have, if Brahman Saguna never sort of collapses into Brahman Nirguna, if the goal is not to leave behind Brahman's Lila, but to see that it's one and the same Brahman, one and the same Atman in all things. I'm curious, is there room in Advaita for thinking of the individual manifestation of Brahman as me, as what I habitually misidentify my fundamental self as, like this psychocorporeal entity? This is not what my most fundamental self is, but this is still part, like, as you say in the Advaita worldview, this is not self, right?
Yes.
This is inclusive within what I really am.
Yes.
So I'm curious, is there room in Advaita for the idea of like a personal immortalization of this manifestation of the self that I am in this life, or a deification of this self, this jiva, this individual that I currently am? Or is how do you understand like what is liberated life after this life, I guess, is what I'm asking.
So David, you are correct. Let's take a step back. In the process, and I'll come to the question that you've formulated at the end of your statement. In the process of teaching and helping the student, the seeker, to understand the truth of herself, one of the methods is to distinguish between and I discussed it a bit in the Advaita Worldview. You will recall, to distinguish between the knower and the known, the seer and the seen, the subject and the object. So, if I am aware of something, I am aware of it as an object I know it, therefore I am the knower, and what I know is the object. So that logic, or that process of discernment, I am sure that I am not the pen that I hold in my hand because I hold it as an object. It is seen. I am the seer. It is known. I am the knower. It is an object. I am the subject, and so on. The Advaita teacher invites the student to employ that logic to think about the physical body, to think about the sense organs, to think about thoughts in the mind, and so on, until you discover yourself to be that which is never an object, always the subject, the knower, that which can never become an object of knowledge. So now, if you stop there, if you say this is the teaching that Atman, or the true self, is that which is aware of everything without itself ever becoming an object of awareness, without ever being objectified. And that is true. The Upanishads do make that claim, that the Atman can never be objectified, because if it is objectified, then it becomes finite. Everything objectified is limited. It is finite. But if you stop there, then we stop in with what you just said, would be a dualistic worldview. It would not be a non-dual worldview, because then you have the Brahman, or the Atman, which is the light through which everything is known, everything is objectified. It is that because of which the eyes see, the air hears, the skin feels, we smell. It is the ground of all perceptual and knowing processes. And then you have the world of objects, the material world, the body, etc., etc. But this is a tradition that it is not a dual tradition. So then you have to, after that step, or that process of teaching, you have to come back and say, but after separating, distinguishing the self from the non-self, there is nothing but the self. Brahman alone is. This is non-dualism. Brahman alone is. And there is nothing but Brahman. So the fundamental claim of Advaita is not that the world, as I articulate it, it is not that the world is an illusion, or that the many do not exist. It is the fundamental claim of Advaita is a claim of ontological singularity. There is one reality that takes many forms, without being depleted or diminished by these forms. Because when you read the Upanishads, this is a common point of beginning. Let me become many. If we were to speak of creation, or to use the terminology of creation, it arises out of this wish on the part of the one to multiply itself, to become many. But the text will always come back and say, but there's only one still.
Yeah. I'm thinking of in the Bhagavata Purana, where it seems to speak as though Vishnu creates an innumerable number of worlds, right?
Right.
It seems to me that sort of across the board, if you have a classical monotheism, right? Like if you have a classical vision of God as Sat Chit and Ananda, as being consciousness and bliss, then you inevitably have to come to two conclusions, I think. One of them is panentheism, that really monotheism is panentheism, because the minute that God is infinite, you can't say here's God over here and here's the world over here, right?
Yes.
Because that conditions God. But then the other thing that happens is you then have to acknowledge, well, at least from God's perspective, there must be an infinite number of worlds, right? There must, because there is no limit to the ways that God can manifest God's self.
Right. Right.
So then my question, sorry I didn't mean to cut you off there, but
go ahead.
Just to specify. So there are these infinite number of forms in which God can manifest, right? But two of those forms are me and you.
Yeah.
And those are, from God's perspective, God being outside of time, right? Brahman being the timeless. These are not just like, oh, like, well, I've got an infinite number of other forms, so, you know, who cares about these two? It's like, no, God desires, God has like eros to become you, to become me.
Yes.
So when we achieve liberation, does that stop? Does that God being me and being you, does that stop, or does something else happen? Is there some sense in which these particular manifestations of Atman endure, or are glorified, or are something?
Yes. So let's this is, all of your questions are really, you know, so central and of such deep interest to me, David. So I said I'm, you know, always trying to step back a little when you ask a question, to look at the underlying issue that you're lifting up. So there, and here I think there are differences in the interpretation of the tradition. So both of us, you know, understand Advaita to be fundamentally a teaching about ontological non-dualism. Not that we don't dismiss the fact of the many, but the many as sharing one fundamental nature. So if you get to the heart of anything that is, ultimately it will be Brahman. It will be Brahman appearing as these forms. And we have a conversation exactly to that issue in one of the Upanishads, the Chandogya Upanishad, where the father is teaching his son about the nature of Brahman, about the self, and asks him to break a tiny seed. And so the boy keeps on breaking the seed, and the father keeps on asking, what do you see? What do you see? And eventually the son says, but I can't see anything else. I don't see anything now. And then the father says, but my son, that which you say you don't see, that is from which that is the source of this tree, and that is what you are. That is what the tree is, and that's what is what you are. And then we have the famous line, you know, Tat Tvamasi, that thou art, that thou art, that thou art. It's repeated 12 times in that conversation. Now, you have some interpretations of this ontological non-dualism that go in the direction, because everything has the same ontological nature, that go in the direction of, I would say, devaluing the distinctiveness of each form. Okay, you know, everything is Brahman. You know, you can see how that could lead to, well, the one form really is not significant in any way from another form. I think that I read that as a kind of devaluation of the uniqueness of each form, by arguing for ontological non-dualisms. But the question that I am asking myself, and I think I'm hearing in your question, is whether do we have to read the tradition in this way? Does knowing the ultimate nature of beings to be not two deter us from celebrating, treasuring, eros, to use the word, embracing and valuing the unique nature of each being? Because each being does have a unique nature, and that's the beauty of the world. It seems diversity, the universe seems to have value for diversity. That's why we each have, you know, a different fingerprint, if you look at it in that way. You know, two snowflakes are not the are not the same. Diversity seems to be, in my understanding, the way in which the one celebrates itself or expresses its nature. If we take, to use another analogy, David, from common human experiences, let's say a great artist, Michelangelo, working in marble, creating exquisite figures, David and Bacchus and Apollo, to name a few. When we stand before the great works, the enduring works of a Michelangelo, the fact that the material out of which he is working is the same, does not impede the experience of joy, the delight that we see in each work. We can appreciate his genius in the unique figures that he produces. In fact, our appreciation for him may even increase by saying, what radiant beauty, what complex patterns that he creates out of this one material, and how special is each one. Now, and I think that on this side, let's come to your question. On this side of reality, that's my approach. I want to celebrate the uniqueness of each being. I don't want to use ontological non-dualism to diminish that beauty, because in a sense that uniqueness will never be duplicated. It has eternal significance. And David, in order to appreciate the one, we don't have to homogenize it, right? We don't have to level this uniqueness. This is a point that I like to make all the time. That at the heart of Advaita doesn't require us to dissolve the many, to replace the many in order to appreciate the one. What it asks us to do is to see the one in the many, or to see the many as expressions of the one. And we, in a sense, we see this pattern replicated in nature in different ways. We can only push analogies to a certain extent, but what splendid colors come out of the same earth. How many diverse fruits can grow side by side, drawing nutrients out of the same soil. So if that's my argument, then when it comes to specifically to the question, and I continue to engage with this question, because the texts are pretty. They don't like to speak too much about the post-mortem. Let me put it that way: or the post-mortem condition of the liberated person. Except to say that he or she is Brahman. But he or she is Brahman here also. And he or she is still Brahman, even with a unique nature or expression. So if the self-multiplication if the many is a celebration of the self-multiplication or the expression of the one, I ask, in response to your question, why is it not possible also that this is also through post-mortem? I don't understand. I can't describe to you what it would look like post-mortem, because it's not time and space as we would conceive it or understand it. But I do not see, and I hope this will get to your question, I do not see why the dissolution of the unique expression of each one is a necessary condition for post-mortem liberation.
Yeah.
We have Jivan Mukta, or Jivan Mukti, which is the term you used just now, living liberation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we have what we call Videha Moksha. Deha means body, V means without the body. So it means, liberation post-mortem, after the death of the body. If liberation in life is possible while we have bodies and we have unique minds and dispositions, and it does not impede the reality of liberation, why is it not possible also post-mortem?
Well,
yeah.
So a figure from 20th century Hinduism who actually he's been important to me since I was a kid, and it was reading back over something of his that made me think to ask you this. So Paramahansa Yogananda, in his lengthy commentary on the Gospels, the Second Coming of Christ, basically makes the argument that on his point of view, and I don't know enough about yoga darshana. I know a lot about yoga in terms of its like classical textual construction. I don't know enough about certain aspects of yoga to judge. It seems to me that probably a lot of what he's saying is fairly idiosyncratic. But his interpretation of the resurrection of Jesus is effectively, it's really striking to me, because he basically makes the argument Jesus realizes his oneness with Brahman, and once he has done that, he can now identify with his body, his manifestation as Jesus whenever he should like, right? And he can reconstruct any of the bodies kind of at will. He's no longer trapped by them, but that doesn't mean that they are just eliminated or annihilated. And that's right. I don't know what you think of that. I mean, I know it comes out of a slightly different Hindu tradition or school of thinking, but as a model for articulating, how could it be that the liberated person endures as themselves after death? I don't know. Well, I'm curious.
No, I think it's an interesting thought. So let me add to that by going back to a thread of the earlier in our conversation. So the human problem, if I may use that terminology, is not the fact that I have a body, that I have a form, I have a unique constitution, I am a unique form in this creation. That's not the problem. The problem is avidya, ignorance of the truth of myself, ignorance of the truth of my nature. So as I said, if ignorance is the problem, then having a form, having a physical form, existence in the world, in and of itself does not impede liberation. What impedes it is ignorance. So even in one place in his commentary, this is where he's commenting on a text called a Brahma Sutra Bhashya, Shankara opens the possibility, mentions the possibility of liberated persons being born again, which is like very similar to what you are speaking, but born, and again, as you indicated with Paramhamsa Yogananda's interpretation, but liberated in a condition where they are no longer subject to avidya. It's a birth in freedom from avidya. So he leaves that as a possibility, which indicates a certain very fascinating way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
In some ways, it has some similarities, David, to the Buddhist concept of the bodhisattva, the bodhisattva who chooses to be born again and again, out of compassion for other living beings. So this is a person who makes an intentional choice to be born.
I was actually, thank you for mentioning that, because I wanted to ask you, you bring up in a couple of your books the relationship between Advaita and Buddhism, or at least you mention Buddhism as sort of a close conversation partner with Advaita historically. And I'm curious because on the one hand, there is a lot in common. And on the other hand, Buddhist doctrines of anatta and non-theistic ways of speaking of ultimate reality, at least superficially, they seem contradictory. I can think of ways that are Edic outside of the tradition that I might read that material and say, no, like I can integrate this into my own way of thinking. But I'm curious, because like obviously the ideal of the Bodhisattva or the ideal of the liberated person being reborn out of compassion, it's a very beautiful ideal. I'm curious, how does Advaita traditionally make sense of Buddhism, particularly in its Mahayana form? Because I know Shankara is, he's operating in a context where it's one of the most popular religions in Southeast Asia at the time, right?
Yes.
So how would he make sense of anatta? How do you make sense of those kinds of Buddhist distinctives that, acknowledging that someone who's an insider to Buddhist tradition may not really seek any kind of, intellectual kind of reconciliation there. I don't know. What would you make of that? Sorry, I'm tripping.
No, it's an important, and as you know, and I think as you indicate, the relationship between Hindu traditions, especially the Advaita tradition, and Buddhist traditions, such as especially Mahayana tradition. There are people who again speak on the side of difference between these traditions, and then there are those who speak on the side of similarities, if not identity in viewpoints. Now, I come as one who affirms, similarities between the traditions. Especially the Mahayana tradition, I have very good friends who are practitioners of those and teachers of those traditions, and who speak, so far as a scholar practitioner of the Advaita tradition, I am familiar, and I commit myself to the teaching about the truth, or the Atman that constitutes the nature of everyone, the identity of my own self with every other self. And this, to me, is very similar to the Mahayana affirmation about the Buddha nature that is present in everyone. Everyone, we will not even say everyone has Buddha nature, but everyone is Buddha nature. Buddha nature is the true nature of every living being, and that the purpose of our existence, if we are to speak of it in the language of purpose, is to discover or to awake to our Buddha nature. So in that sense, David, I think that there is some similarity in understanding of the problem of avidya, that because of avidya we are not awake to, or we don't know the truth of ourselves as Buddha nature. So from Advaita perspective, I say, we don't know the truth of ourselves as Brahman. Brahman is not true, and that that Buddha nature is not something that has to be created. We don't have to. It's not separate from us by time or space. It's something that is here even when we don't know it. Something that we have to discover, we have to understand, or the language of awakening is quite commonly used. So I see. I don't want to say that these traditions are not don't have important points of difference, but I would look to these areas to see points of contact, points for conversation. You know, the optimism about human nature. You know, we are not fundamentally flawed in nature. That ignorance can be overcome, and that we can awaken to the truth of ourselves, and this awakening is associated with awakening to goodness, to truth, to beauty, to compassion. The significance of compassion. So the liberated person in the tradition of Advaita is described in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, as one who identifies with others in suffering and in joy. In other words, one who's awakened into being a compassionate human being. And of course, the Buddhist tradition gives such high value to karuna, to compassion. So I see, I see a point of meeting there. Then there are the differences, you know, the Buddha's refutation or challenge to social hierarchy, to caste, and so on. So I come down on the side of at least wanting to seek deeper shared perspectives between these traditions, the Advaita and Mahayana tradition. And from my study, my dialogue with Mahayana practitioners, my thought is that there's much more in common between these traditions than differences. You know, one of the accusations that was made against Shankara by other Hindu traditions with whom he disagreed was that he was a hidden Buddhist.
Yeah.
He said he was, in Sanskrit, Prachanna Buddha, one who is a disguised Buddhist.
Yeah, what a compliment, you know. What a compliment. Okay, so let's see. That's a great answer. First of all, I definitely identify the same points of continuity, and you know, David Bentley Hart has this great little dialogue in his book Roland and Moonlight, where he suggests that the Advaitin doctrine of Atman and the Buddhist doctrine of Anatta, at least as it's understood by Mahayana, there is a way of understanding these where they end up affirming the same basic truth, which is that the self is not a determinate content identifiable with like a finite entity, right? Yes. When Buddhists say there is no stable self that stands under all of these changes that happen to you, you know, spiritually, bodily, like identifying yourself as a discrete entity from everything else is the product of ignorance. That seems to me to be not other than what Advaita is saying when it says that, well, it's one and the same Atman underlying everything, right?
All is Brahman, yes.
Yeah. I tend to find, I love the story in early Buddhist texts where, you know, the universe emerges and Brahma is the first deva to emerge. And the other devas emerge and they look around at the universe and they're like, wow, did you make this? And Brahma's like, yeah, I made this, right? And this is sort of the Buddha's like critique of notions of a creator God. But it also seems to me, right, like what the Upanishads are saying when they talk about creation and what classical monotheisms in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are really saying when they talk about the creation of the world is not the idea of one discrete being among other discrete beings, you know, tinkering with things. It's the infinite source of existence donating itself to finite beings to exist. And so in that sense, yeah, that's totally the same metaphysics, it seems to me, as everything is really Buddha nature, right? Manifesting in all kinds of finite interdependent forms. That nirvana is really samsara. They're actually not two different things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, correct. The rejection of dualism in all of its forms and expressions. Yes.
Yeah. So that leads me to the question, is it possible, on your view, to attain liberation outside of Advaita, or does one need to be an Advaitan? So, I mean, it seems to me that there are resources within my tradition, within the broader Christian tradition, within Judaism, within Islam, to come to the same kind of non-dualistic conclusions about reality. It's certainly not centered the way that it is in Advaita, but the resources exist. There's Buddhism, there's Jainism that are seeking the same kind of liberation. But I know that Advaita has a strongly scriptural and traditional methodology for attaining liberation, right? It's very much about study of the Upanishads, study with the teacher, etc. So, what's your take on this? Can I be liberated while being philosophically Advaitan but bhaktically Christian?
So, very good question, David. So, Advaita, let me put it in this way. The Upanishad, and Shankara would certainly agree with this, the Upanishad is not a text, it's a teaching. Right? It's a teaching. And these teachings were transmitted orally, for most of their history before they were printed and put into text. So Advaita is a teaching. Certainly it is a distinctive teaching because there are other teachings, as you have said, dualistic teachings and so on, which are different from Advaita. And I think I could summarize the two essential claims of this teaching in this way. First, that as we would say, one of the important sentences in this teaching, that in Sanskrit, Ayam Atma Brahma, that this Atman is Brahman. Just as as we said, that you are Buddha nature. So that the self is not what we take it to be. It is not this isolated being, separate and distinct from everything else. It is not a thing among other things, but it is the self of all. That's the first proposition. The second claim is what you also mentioned. So the first was, I am Atma Brahman. So the self is Brahman. But to ensure that the teaching is not dualistic, there is a second proposition also found in the Upanishads. It's Sarvam Khalvidam Brahma. And everything is Brahman. So the self is Brahman, but everything, all is Brahman, right? All is Brahman. Bhagavad Gita puts it in Vasudeva Sarvamiti, that the divine is everything. All is divine. These are the two defining claims of what we speak of as the Advaita tradition. So my view is that wherever these teachings are found, these two teachings are found, and these teachings, as we have discussed before, David, these are liberative. They have implications for transforming our understanding of ourselves and our way of being in the world. Wherever these two teachings are found, that's Advaita. And I don't have to make the claim that such teachings are found only within the boundaries. The terminology of Hinduism or Hindu tradition is a historical development, right?
Right.
If you look at teachings in the Taoist tradition, you find similarities. We have spoken about the Buddhist tradition. There are Christian non-dualist thinking, I remember some of my Christian theological friends sharing with me some really interesting teachings that to me, resonate with the Upanishads. So we are speaking here about a tradition that is a teaching, and where such teachings are found, then that is Advaita. And we don't make the claim that these teachings are found only, because as I said, that's why I preface what I was saying, that the Upanishads are not bound volumes, that the Upanishads are teaching. However this teaching is found, that's Advaita. Now, and you yourself indicated this before, that there is a certain emphasis, about this tradition. There are certain methodologies that have been developed to impart this knowledge. It is a certain systematization of this tradition, right? And I talked about methodologies, pedagogical methodologies for transmitting the knowledge. So there's certain development of the tradition in India, but no claim that it is exclusive, to these boundaries, and no claim that only if it is received within these boundaries it can be liberated. But then it must come down to these two fundamental claims: the nature of the self and the nature of reality. The Atman is Brahman, Brahman is everything.
So I have a couple more questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. Do you have a little bit more time, or do you need
Yes.
Okay, sweet.
You can go for 5 minutes or so, that's fine.
Yeah. So I wanted to make sure to talk a little bit about A Hindu Theology of Liberation, because I loved that book.
Thank you.
One of the things I wanted to ask on this, and treat this as kind of a general invitation to talk about, what liberation involves at the social order. So, I imagine that different Hindu schools take this kind of thing with different levels of seriousness. But I know that, in the Mahabharata, in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Puranas, there's this cosmic chronology in Hinduism, right? That suggests that right now we're in Kali Yuga. And you can correct me if I have it wrong. As far as I understand, Kali Yuga goes on for like the next 400,000 years or something.
Unimaginable time.
Yeah, it's very long, and it's not like it's the shortest one of all the kalpas, right? Like the golden age that will follow it will be much longer. But it seems to me, I remember being in my 300 level Hinduism course, and my teacher, Dr. Jack Llewellyn, who, if he sees this, thank you so much for all the teaching you gave me. But I remember him saying something to the effect of like, so, this certainly isn't true of all Hinduism, but some Hindus look at the cosmic calendar that they live in and they think, oh, I'm right smack dab in the middle of everything. Yeah. Things are not going to change from the way they are. Things as they are kind of set in stone. I'm wondering how seriously Advaita takes that worldview, and how, in the midst of like a way of thinking about time like that, how do you cultivate this this social theology of liberation, right? This call, which you do so well for for women, for LGBTQIA people, for children, for outcasts, and I could think of how this also applies to economic injustice and the environment and animals, and I think you talk about animals at one point too. Yes. I mean, it's so great. Do you sense that is that kind of very like active push runs into this other emphasis in Hindu theology, or does it work with it? What do you think?
Well, first, specifically you asked, and surely you are describing, a sort of a cosmological theory that some people do subscribe to, the cycles of the world from in its what we call yugas, Satya, Treta, Dwapara, Kali Yuga, and Kali Yuga is the worst of times to.
Yeah, you're reborn into Kali Yuga, and you're just like, beans. Kali Yuga again, not the golden one.
And then you have interpretations that see these as really representing our own internal states, internal conditions of human beings. So a liberated person is always living in Satya Yuga, which is the highest of all of the yugas, and one in Avidya is in a condition of Kali Yuga. I think on the whole, David, I will respond to your question by saying, because if you take that in a very literal way, and I'm not saying that some people don't, then it becomes, as you rightly hint and suggest in your question, you end up in a place of fatalism. It seems to undermine our free will and our ability to change and to transform ourselves, and to, we end up accepting a certain inevitability, whereas that's, would be inconsistent with all of the urgings of the tradition that, we are free to seek liberation, to overcome avidya. In the same way that, the teachings of karma often deployed and used in ways to justify a certain social order or certain social reality, and then we are asked to be obedient to this reality because it's, this is a consequence of our own choices, and that we could be free from, even as you would, even as we might say with the yugas, you're only free from the characteristics of one yuga when another yuga starts. Similarly, karma has been deployed to argue that you can only be free from a certain social order, hierarchical social order, with rebirth. But that is, I stand among those who want to argue that that's, an unfortunate reading of the teaching on karma, which is fundamentally a teaching about human responsibility and the significance of choice, and about the impact of our choices and on the construction of the social order in which we live. So I certainly recognize your summary of the teaching on the yugas, but coming from the Advaita tradition, I take that I read such texts much more in a metaphorical way, or else, it really reduces us to, really undermines our responsibility.
I was thinking of the distinction that you bring up that Shankara draws between sort of what scripture is authoritative to speak on and what scripture is not authoritative to speak on, right? Like in my own tradition, it's important when you're reading biblical text to understand how ancient people thought about cosmology, right? Like how they thought about the universe, how they thought the world was constructed, how that changed over time. But once you understand that, you're not then like beholden to that, right? Like you're not then beholden to say, oh, well, this construction of the cosmos is in my religious text, so now it's what I have to believe despite all evidence to the contrary, right? And I imagine you could do the same thing with like Puranic, chronology, and say like, well, yeah, like the Puranas, they engage in this way of talking about time and the universe that is kind of fatalistic, but why do they do that, right? Like what is the point of them doing that is actually a more interesting question than like, okay, so in the year 400,000 AD, right? Well, finally, like Kali Yuga will be over. I mean, and it's the same thing like in Christian circles, the problem is always around, it's this perennial difficulty around eschatology, right? It's this perennial difficulty around like, well, is Jesus coming back? What does that mean? What do we do in the meantime, right? Like, do we just kind of twiddle our thumbs and wait, or do we try to make the world better? I so wish the obvious answer to my co-religionists was we try to make the world better. It's just so frequently not.
No, it's a good point, and you're quite right in your summary of Shankara's approach, even though he has such tremendous regard for the traditional teaching and the Shruti, the Upanishads, but he's at the same time, he is quite diligent and faithful to the fact that these texts have a very limited scope of authority. Their business is not to tell us about ancient history or what ancient people believed or what are the arts that they practice or not practice. For him, it's ready to tell us some. It's a teaching that informs us of something that we can't know otherwise. It doesn't duplicate any other source of knowledge, and it should not contradict or be contradicted by what we know about the nature of the universe from other sources.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Rambachan, this has been great. I really hope you'll agree to do this again sometime when the time presents, because I've got like a lot more stuff that I wrote down here that we didn't get to because the conversation was so good. So let's plan to do this again sometime. Otherwise, I wish you a very happy new year and a great next semester of teaching.
It was a pleasure talking to David. I enjoyed our conversation very much, and I'm surely open in the new year that we can find a time to continue speaking with each other, and wish you and your wife great joy in your roles as parents. My wife and I, we've raised three children, so
yes,
we have some experiences to share.
Yes, may it liberate me. So,
yes, it's not inconsistent with your interest in non-dual teachings. So let me know when you post, David, so I can share it on my social media. And we covered the material we covered today was not a duplication of what I spoke with Sad about. So that's quite nice. We discussed almost everything new.
Yeah, it was a great discussion, and so that's a great plug in three ways. First, go buy Dr. Rambachan's books on Amazon. There will be links in the thing that comes under the video. Second, go listen to Saad's podcast with Dr. Rambachan on Tahsil Commons. And third, look here to see Dr. Rambachan again sometime.
Yes.
So, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Be well and be safe, David.
Thank you, and to you, and to you, and to you.
Thank you.